behind the scenes, it was a small group of people that were doing everything.
Welcome back to the GTM podcast. It's your host, Scott Barker.
I want to know how this insane growth actually happened.
Hello and welcome to the Go-to-Market podcast. Happy you're here and hanging with us, looking to level up everything go-to-market. This is Sophie Buonasisi, VP of Marketing at GTM Fund, also running GTM Now, which is the media extension of the GTM Fund brand and includes this podcast. Through GTM Now, we get to share insight from working with hundreds of portfolio companies backed by over 350 of the best in the game go-to-market executive operators who have been there, done that at the world's fastest growing SaaS companies. GTM Now is the place for executive operator insight on what's relevant in go-to-market now. Today, I'm honored to be joined by an incredible operator to discuss AI, Andy Jolls. Andy, welcome.
It's great to be here, Sophie. Thank you for having me. I feel privileged.
Oh, no, the privilege is all ours. It's all ours. But I'd like to give a quick bio for listeners. So Andy is a 25-plus year executive with several years in CMO roles. As a full-stack marketer, Andy has re-architected 6 brands and identities and built 3 funnels from the ground up. He's been a B2B leader in businesses from pre-revenue to over $600 million in ARR. And he co-chairs the CMO group for Pavilion, which includes over 6,000 go-to-market leaders, and is active in several marketing communities. He's also a proud alum of Michigan and Northwestern, and began his machine learning and AI journey a few years ago and has been working in generative AI since then. Currently, he operates his own consultancy, helping leaders with marketing strategy and AI in go-to-market. So, Andy, you started your AI and machine learning journey a few years ago. How did that get started? How did you enter the space, and what's your journey been like thus far?
Yeah, so back in 2018, I joined a company called Mission that today is known as Mission Cloud. It's in the cloud infrastructure space, and really got into the AWS ecosystem. And when you get into that system, you start branching into all the different problem sets. And really one of the more interesting ones is machine learning. And so just diving into what companies were trying to sort of solve around machine learning, and a lot of it getting into more predictive AI at the time, but that sort of set me, kind of on the case a bit. And so I ended up taking a machine learning course at MIT to really understand this a little bit better, and then really started following generative AI back in the GPT-2 days. So it's kind of early. Went and joined a generative AI startup to get my feet sort of even wetter. And have just really been immersed with generative AI since even before the big November 2023 dates when ChatGPT started to roll out and really started to impact more of our lives.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen some interesting progressions too in the space now, going from ChatGPT 2 to now the current use cases. And you've been sharing actually some really interesting ones I've noticed particularly on LinkedIn, but I'm sure with broader communities too, around different use cases with ChatGPT 4. So for example, an interesting one that you called out some good use cases for GTM Fund around language too.
Right.
And just being able to translate with ease to different languages. So I'd love to hear some of these kind of tactical use cases that you've discovered along your journey.
Yeah, there's so many, and and I think that's it's hard to parse, because when you're spending so many hours trying to just experiment, and we'll talk about this in terms of where I advise companies to try to get moving and get started. A lot of it is just to get moving and get started, start actually using using some of these tools, and I really advise to also just use them sort of in your personal life. I think. I haven't shared this with you, but actually one of the first things that I did that was sort of momentous for me was I actually had ChatGPT help write my father's obituary. And it was it was an amazing journey. I was really stressed for time, and I was doing it with my stepmother. So I had this experience of like, working somebody from a different generation who was not as used to, technology and a little fearful of technology, but seeing what it could actually just do from a writing perspective. And by the way, like the first draft was not so great, but then we asked it to actually write in the style of the Wall Street Journal. We were like, the Wall Street Journal does obituaries and it has a very different kind of style. And so we had it right to that style. So and what it produced was really amazing. So I really do. I wanted to tell that story because I really encourage folks. I think a lot of times I see people are just trying to use these tools at work and really trying to figure out how you can actually apply them in your personal life and make it sort of a daily routine. I think it's one of the first big pieces of advice that I give. But you also, you mentioned, I think it's just going to open up a lot of avenues for us. I think, language and being able to localize is one particular use case, which I just think a lot of us felt like, well, this is too hard at our stage. And I think generative AI is pushing this down and making this more possible so that more companies can do this. The smallest company can now have access to translation capabilities and start to really broaden their audience. Whereas, if you and I were starting a company several years ago, we would say, "Gosh, let's pick a geo and stick to this market." Well, now if you and I start a software company, we can decide, do we actually want to go more global and really get into to multiple languages. So that's another great use case.
That's fantastic. And I mean, that's monumental in terms of how people think about go to market, is just having these geographic barriers kind of crumbling down, if you will, and having access to a more global market is going to entirely change how we go to market with different strategies. With that said, are there other core areas of go to market that you've either seen or predict will greatly change with the advent of AI?
Um, And I'm gonna take the risk of picking sort of a non-global analog of using baseball, and say like we are in the really, really early innings. Like I'm not even sure we're in the bottom of the first. Like we are in the top of the first inning, and so we're still really early days. So I like the Gartner framework. Gartner has a framework where they basically divide this and say, think about this as quick wins, think about this as differentiated use cases, and then think about this as in the third stage is transformational initiatives. So whether you're a startup or a big company, and I'm sure we're going to talk about both, I think it's good to actually think about this in those three frames. And I think you've got to sort of see like where are you? Why I bring up the baseball analog is to say like it's okay to focus on the quick wins. I think 2023 we saw quick wins and go to market. We're really all about writing. Like let's figure out how can we write emails faster? How can we on the marketing side, how can we write press releases? How can we actually write copy? How can we do all that? And really the enemy in the story was sort of like starting it with a blank page. And so like ChatGPT and other tools like it, and we'll talk about other tools as well, like really solved for this of being able to like, okay, now I have a jump off point. And so I think we were looking for all the natural places. And I think if you're a startup, that is the right place. And if you're a really small startup or a bootstrap startup, like that's the right place to start. Like, let's start with something that's actually really low hanging fruit, very easy. I think that this can actually help like right away. So I think we're doing that. I think we're starting to move into more image and more video, which is why you see me posting about it, because I think we're going to be looking for use cases to apply, more of the visual medium using generative AI. I think that's really going to happen this year. I think we're going to get into agents. I don't know how far we're going to really get in 2024, but I think we're going to see some experimentation around that. But really like just looking through the jobs to be done and seeing, okay, what are all the things that we do today, and what are the things that we can sort of quickly impact? Let's look at those first. But maybe also just stepping back, and if you're big enough of a startup, you can say, I'm going to take some people and I want you to think about quick wins. I'm going to take other people. I want you to think about a differentiated use case, and then other people are thinking about transformational initiatives. Now, let me talk about the differences between those two, the last two, because I think it's really obvious what quick wins are. But to me, transformational is like, do I have to fundamentally, or do we have to fundamentally change our business? Is this going to change us and be so disruptive to change our offering that we really actually have to like pivot? We've got to move. If we're a barge, like we've got to really move the barge. A differentiated use case might be something that's more like, no, we can actually figure out how to use this technology. We're not shifting the direction of the company, but we can figure out a way to actually get this to help us like be differentiated, and be different from the other players in the space. So I think having people think about all three, that might be hard to do if you're a 2-person, company. But if you've got 30 people in your company, I think that's probably a good way to think about it. You may want to, instead of having everybody think about quick wins, having some people think about, okay, like you all go think about quick wins, and then we're going to think about think about these other 2 stages.
No, that makes sense. And there's kind of 2 use cases that we see most commonly at GTM Fund and field a lot of questions around AI. It's the use case of a founder or startup executive team, very lean, nimble team. And then there's the IC role, or perhaps a leader in a larger organization. And so if we think about this 3-step framework, quick wins, differentiated value, and transformational, if we take the first cohort of founders, like how quickly should somebody be accelerating through these 3 stages? At what point do they transition? Because they can start with quick wins, but at what stage with a lean team can you look at differentiated?
Yeah, I think you could, and again, I think it matters. Like, even it matters just sort of the sheer number of people you have. I mean, if you're a founder and you're already up to 10 people, I think you can start to spread your wings a little bit. But as we'll talk about, I think it's just really important to not be overwhelmed. Here's what I'm seeing right now, Sophie, is like people are a bit paralyzed. And so I went to a Pavilion dinner in LA, and I asked people at the dinner, just by show of hands, how many of you have used ChatGPT? And every hand went up. I said, by show of hands, how many of you are actually paying for GPT Plus? And I think, including me, 3 hands went up. So I was surprised. I was like, oh, okay. So let's have a discussion about why and why not. I then asked how many people were using the mobile app, and I think it was 2.
With you being one of them, probably.
With me being one of them. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. And I think part of what we're in a little bit of a dangerous spot right now, which is people are feeling a little bit paralyzed by the number of choices. I mean, there are, OpenAI announced custom GPTs, and then a few months later did the store. There are 3 million custom GPTs that they reported that number. There are about 160,000 that are public. Okay, so how do I go and search and discover this, right? If I go to one of the many directory websites on AI tools, there are 8,000 tools to look at, many of which I call AI wrappers. Like, they've basically just plugged into the OpenAI API, and they're just working, kind of to overlay that with an offering. So I think that's the thing, I spend time on with folks is to your question of like, where should you start? It's like, well, don't try to bite off too much, and really think about sort of how you can have this impact, your motion, not just go to market, but your operation overall, where you think can have sort of the quickest impact. And I'll probably steal something from a future question, but like I'm often advising people that look, the answers to any question aren't yes and no, they're yes and no and not now. Which is, so it's okay to basically choose 3 AI tools or 4, and say, these other ones look great, but I'm not gonna touch these at least for 6 months, or I'm not gonna touch this, for a year. So I think when it comes to founders, that's the big one, is really just trying to figure out, like, what do you work on now versus what do you work on later?
That's great advice, because I think it nails exactly on those 2 cohorts of what everyone's experiencing is a little bit of analysis paralysis. There's so many different options to individually dive in, and there's always the shiny object syndrome in terms of the next latest and greatest technology, or wrapper even. And hey, I'm not a wrapper hater. I appreciate the different use cases too. I don't mind wrappers at all, but it certainly does make for distractions, because there are lots of different things. And we always say here at GTM Fund, the best tools are the ones that you are using. It's great to have access to them. It's great to have them accessible. But if you are not using them, and oftentimes usage isn't even at its maximum capabilities. So it's how do you get more out of what you're doing, and the actual usage out of it is what will translate to direct impact on go-to-market.
That's a great point too, because most of the tools that you already have in your stack have added AI capabilities. And so if you're not even starting with those, right? Like if you're using Notion, but you're not playing around with Notion AI, then you're probably missing something, right? If you're using HubSpot, but you're not really playing around with what they've added in AI, then you're skipping steps. And I do think it's important to really look at your stack first before you just start strapping on more tools that you need to use.
Definitely. Great point. And now that is a little bit at the individual level, how everyone is using AI. If we think about operationalizing AI across the go-to-market function, this is a really interesting one. So you mentioned you were at a dinner chatting about AI. I was recently at a dinner too, chatting about AI a couple weeks ago.
I think I was supposed to make that dinner.
Next time. But a big challenge for everyone was operationalizing across the team, because everyone is doing exactly like you said, researching individually, finding all these different tools, getting distracted or getting embedded with them. And it's how do you actually operationalize that across your go-to-market function? So one thing that we've seen teams doing particularly well, or is working for them, is leaning into kind of quality over quantity, as you mentioned. So picking just, 1 to 2, really mastering those as a team, and then knowledge sharing across individual tools. So, one company, for example, has a Slack channel and it's new AI. And so anyone, no matter what role you are in the company, can add their newest thoughts, anything that they found. And that way everyone can kind of knowledge share, but not get distracted. If we're not operationalizing this, it's just for everyone to surface learnings, because there's so much. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts in terms of how to actually operationalize the use cases of technology across the entire go-to-market function together.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've mentioned a couple of great ways, and I'll even go up to. I was listening to the CEO of Sanofi, just big pharmaceutical company, and what they did was they first off changed their mission and basically put AI into their mission statement. Like they want to be like the pharma AI company. I'm butchering the mission statement, but it's basically like they're really leaning in. And then the other thing they did is they said, well, we want 23,000 employees using this once a month. And we want 9,000 employees using this every day. So that was the path that they went, sort of to operationalize this. And I think that probably makes sense when you're sort of at that size and you're at that scale. I like a lot of the things that you mentioned. So the first one is I apply the rule of 3, which is and I apply this in a lot of different places. So I just think it's great to just really constrain and say, team, like we're just going to work to figure out like 3 things that we're going to add, And then we're going to get really, really good at those three things. And let's do that as a team. Let's build a Slack channel. Let's build mechanisms that we actually can do knowledge share. I have something that I do, which I just added like in the last couple of years. My teams will work in sprints. And so I will have them on Monday tell me what are they working on? And then on Friday, we actually demo and we record the demo. And then we actually make a recap of the demo. So we make a recap that we actually send out to sort of to make it more available to the broader organization. But by having people demo every week what they've actually built, it gives a sort of natural knowledge share. It also allows people to practice speaking, which is great. But it's more about kind of getting the knowledge share, and people can actually show like, this is how I used AI. Now, when I put that structure in, it wasn't put in for generative AI, but it naturally lends itself. It's like, let me show you how I actually used, one of these three tools to accomplish what I'm trying to actually get done. So I think that's I think having the Slack channel, choosing a finite number that you're going to go after, and figure out like, what are the problems, what are the jobs to be done that we're really trying to attack, and trying to sort of like hone in on that. So you don't get distracted and say like, oh, let me go solve this other problem. I will say the other thing that I think is really interesting is last year it felt like sales folks and marketing folks were doing a lot of experimenting, but it didn't actually feel like a lot was happening on the rev ops side or the marketing ops side, which I think is going to be really curious. And I was just talking to Taimur Tariq, who's a RevOps operator. I was just talking to him yesterday, and we both think it's like this is gonna be a lot where this actually ultimately ends up living, is within RevOps and marketing ops. So they've got to like start getting ramped and getting more into this, and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see that happen. So as I said, like last year was more about text. This year is like not only is it about sort of image and video, but it's about workflow and efficiency and getting in. And so we were talking about use cases of actually like plugging in OpenAI, so it can actually help you like route messages like in your customer journey. And it could actually like read through and determine like, oh, this open-ended response means this, so I'm going to route them to this response, or I'm going to create a unique response based on that. So we'll start to see that, but I think it's like just keeping it finite is really the key.
That use case in terms of living in RevOps, brilliant. I would be surprised if people aren't already doing that. I hope. I'd say based on your dinner responses, perhaps not though. But where would you say that would fall in terms of the 3-step progression of quick wins, differentiated, and transformational?
I think it's somewhere like I think some of these things are quick wins, but I think some of it's starting to really get into differentiated use case. If you're really starting to get into the workflow layers, you're probably doing things that are going to be, it's just more heavy lifting that you'll actually start to be differentiated from what you'll see competitors do. Because like anything in life, I think we're going to see a lot of the companies are going to do sort of whatever is easy. And we're already, by the way, seeing this in the custom GPT arena. Is the reason there are so many custom GPTs is they're easy to make, but the ones that are actually really good and actually have a moat, you can tell like there's been some real effort put into them. And I think we'll see the same thing here. Is like if a team is really spending some energy and some time thinking about a particular problem and how to solve a really hard problem using generative AI, they're going to end up having something that's a bit differentiated, because it's just going to be harder for companies to figure out like, oh, how do they how did they do this? How did they build it? And it just won't be obvious.
That makes sense. And I want to switch gears a little bit here because we always try to learn through stories here on the GTM podcast. And sometimes, criticism or tough love, whatever verbiage you prefer, can be a detractor for progress for some. But sometimes it actually creates a good chip on the shoulder and feel for progression for others. And I know, most of us at GTM Fund, we don't mind a little chip on the shoulder. And personally, I operate better with a bit of the latter to get me going. But it sounds like you operate similarly from experiences back that you've had. I mean, starting your career, maybe even starting a business school. So I'd love to hear a little bit more around that career progression and how those experiences really shaped your career.
Yeah, I think probably most of the listeners to to this podcast probably don't like being told that they can't do something, and that this won't work. And that happened to me in business school. I before business school, I had a background. I was a, a consultant slash analyst for a market research consulting firm in the food business. And I knew I wanted to work in technology. And I had a HR representative at Apple tell me like, well, you're not going to get a job at Apple because you don't have an engineering background. You don't have a degree. And I remember telling her, and I'm like, yeah, I look forward to meeting you at the summer picnic because you just basically kind of gave me all the fight that I really need to go, to go after that. Um, Now I want to a tangent a little bit to say that like, uh, this was back the project that I worked on at Apple was a product. The project name was Bogart, and what it was a search engine before there was the internet. So this was a search engine that did more natural language search. It did more, had things like stemming and which, used to like complete what people might be thinking about in a search. We had all of that like way before Google or Yahoo or any of these folks. And we were building it to basically work on internal, um, structured and unstructured data. So we were trying to figure out like how does an insurance company figure out like how do they actually search their database of claims? And so we actually were building that early days. So it's fun to look back and think of some of the things that we were building out really really early. But I think the thing that and maybe the lesson is and one more important thing about my Apple experience is so I show up and and I've been hired onto an engineering team. I'm a marketing person. So I look at my boss and I say, hey Joel, I'm like the only marketing person around. And he's like, well, I really wasn't getting the support from marketing that I thought I should be getting. So I used one of my engineering recs and I hired a marketing person. And your first job is to go repair the damage that I've done with the marketing team. But which I did. And then, but what I was given was this amazing gift of actually sitting with an engineering team for an entire summer and then realizing like I was learning a ton about collaboration across teams that I just didn't realize I really needed to learn. So then when I went on to like my next company and I was more on an embedded marketing team, it was fascinating because I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I'm just used to sort of hanging out with all these people over here and collaborating. And it was more like, well, the engineers are over here and marketing's over here. And I was like, oh God, they're like that. Like, I'm not used to this world at all. So I just felt really grateful, not only for sort of the perseverance part of that story, but the collaboration part of that story, because it really taught me how do I pretend like I'm on every team, right? And how do I live like I'm working with every team? It was great.
That's amazing. Yeah, some really good learnings there to distill it down too. Well, usually I would say, hey, let's switch to a founder question, but we actually touched on it earlier. It was around how smaller teams can actually ramp up and think about AI use cases. So I'd love to hijack the question and ask you some very tactical questions around how you are using ChatGPT 4 or any other AI tools. If there's any kind of cool tools or use cases that you found that are worth mentioning.
Yeah. So look, besides like I think some of what everybody's doing sort of around the writing pieces, let me talk about a few more that me and it's like some of the peers who I think of sort of more the more forward thinkers. A lot of folks, including me, have used this to really figure out like, well, how do I tackle SEO? Now, it's really been interesting is it is really helpful and kind of start to finish from like writing an SEO strategy to basically getting all the way tactical down to actually writing the assets that you actually will need to improve SEO. So you can actually just go end to end. You can just start it with like, and you want to be very careful about the prompting, the steps that you take, and you want to go slow and methodical. Just don't ask it like, hey, this is the Sophie product, like write me an SEO strategy. You need to teach it, right? But you can actually do that end to end. Even so that's one use case. Let me give you another one, which I think this is also something I'm starting to see a lot more, which is we have a ton of data and we don't have a great way to analyze the data. And ChatGPT has really solved for this. So you can take a data set, and I did this as an example, by the way, and I think I believe I posted about this. Like I took just to show this as an example, I took the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index data, and I basically just fed it into ChatGPT-4. I'm like, here's the data set. I'm like, develop charts and write insights based on this data. And it will do it. So now let's apply that to more kind of GTM. So like you could take the data that's in your CRM, you can very easily pull it into a spreadsheet, anonymize it, just give every customer a code number, and then you can feed that into ChatGPT-4, and it will like, even if you basically just from the column headings, it'll start to spit out insights. If you tell it a little bit more and say, I'm actually looking for, let's say I'm trying to like understand like win-loss, and just like, well, help me identify like my ICP. This will help you actually do it. So it'll actually take the data and synthesize it, and you'll be able to go way faster than you ever could before. So just thinking about all the data possibilities that you have and going through and doing that. One of my peers, Lisa Adams, she did this for G2 data recently. It was fantastic. So like she basically just like pulled down a bunch of G2 data and fed it in and just had it do an analysis. So the data analysis piece of not only like GPT-4, but I'll talk about other tools too, like Bard and Perplexity. They can do a little bit of this as well. And I'm sort of, again, I'm a 3-tool person. So like those are the 3 tools like I'm used to using the most.
Bard, ChatGPT, and what was the third one?
Perplexity. So perplexity.ai. So Bard is Google's. And I was given a gift in that, like I really was kind of forced to use Bard for a little while. And so I was like, all right, let me use this. Cause I went through a stage where it was like, we weren't allowed to use ChatGPT. So I was like, okay, let me use Bard. So I used Bard and realized like, there's a lot of things that it's not as good as ChatGPT, but there are some things that actually does quite well. So, and I wish I could give you sort of a recipe book. I can't. It's just like a lot of times I will put things into multiple engines and sort of see what the output looks like. But the data analysis piece of and being able to construct tables is really helpful. And you're just looking for things that are like time savings. This will give you a GTM parallel I'm speaking to a group of executives next week, and they have a page where they have all their bios on the page, right? You guys probably have this too. Well, I could just take that and basically copy and paste all the bios and feed it into one of these engines and say, you know what? I really want this constructed as a table because these bios have all the information, but I want to see, like, in a table, what are all the schools that they went to? What are all the, board seats that they're on? What are all the, current companies? What are all the past companies? Can you organize this in a way? So imagine you can do that same thing from a go-to-market perspective. If you find a page that has a lot of bios, and let's say you're, trying to find, LPs, and you find like, oh, this page, but it's not really organized in a way. Well, you can have it help you organize the data so that you can actually feed it into your CRM versus just having like some intern actually do it. So I'm really playing around with a couple of those. I mentioned the SEO example, the different like data analytics examples, and then the one that I mentioned before of just being able to like start to plug in on customer journey and see like, okay, there are pieces of this journey that I can actually start to tackle and try to automate. Because we're having to do this in a very sort of manual way. Because ideally we get to the point, I don't think we're quite there yet, but we just say like, look, I should be able to teach you enough that you should just dynamically create a nurture. Like I shouldn't actually have to map out and branch for you. You should actually do it. Survey should actually work the same way, by the way, in the future. It won't work that way now. Right now we'll tackle that piece, but that's another great go-to-market use case. Like we're trying to actually tackle survey data and try to figure out like, well, how do we deal with all this open-ended data? By the way, the G2 example, you could do the same thing with Gong, right? You take all your all your recorded stuff, you could pull that down, anonymize it, and basically feed it in and say like, what is this actually telling me? And so those are all things to get to pretty quickly, because hopefully, even if you're just even a small startup, you're starting to collect that kinds of, that data, and certainly tackling all the third party data that's out there.
Mm-hmm. And qualitative data, I mean, there's just immense gold in qualitative data. So having the ability to actually process it quicker just creates that feedback loop even quicker. I know we use ChatGPT to do qualitative feedback analysis, super helpful. And I really like actually what you said. I think there's good learning there around you're actually feeding things through multiple tools. So you don't have an exact recipe. And I think that's a good learning for everyone in terms of get your feet wet, right? There is not, it'd be nice to have the exact recipe, but everyone's probably got a little bit of a different kind of spin on their perfect chocolate chip muffin recipe, right? So it's really about getting yourself familiarized and understanding what that recipe is for you.
I think that's the answer to the question when people say, okay, I'm paralyzed. How do I get started? And I'll usually ask some discovery questions. I'm like, so do you have kids? Do you have teenagers? Right? Like, do you have middle schoolers? And people will tell me like, if they do, I'm like, okay, well, let's go down that path. Like I'm using it to help my kids with their homework. I'm using it in the kitchen to create recipes. Like we're having fun with it. I'm like, let's create a recipe that has, you know, these 4 spices, but it doesn't have this one ingredient because somebody's allergic to it. Right. You can't do that. And so you can't do that with a recipe book. Right. So I think that's pretty important to kind of get the creative juices flowing, because I'm certainly a big believer that, that AI is probably not going to take away jobs so much as it's going to take away jobs from people who are not embracing this, and not embracing AI. So I think, I just want everybody to set their homepages to, one of those 3 tools and start moving with us. I want everybody to download the mobile apps. And when they go for a walk, they just start to open the app. I think the mobile thing is completely underutilized.
You actually got me onto the mobile thing. and it's replaced a transcription app that I had, because when ideas strike, oftentimes, you're driving, whatever it may be. So I'll actually use a transcription app, and now I have ChatGPT on my phone. Thanks to you.
And it's doing that. Plus, it's really just it's really a thought partner. So I think just trying to build some of those habits and creating some daily habits around this um, should make it so that people just get the natural curiosity. Because I think part of the enemy for the category right now is people will tell me like, "Oh, well, I just didn't think I could use X for that." And like, I didn't think I could use ChatGPT or Perplexity to do that, or Bard to do that, or whatever tool that they're talking about, right? So some of that is like getting people to see like, well, need you to build this into more of your motion so that you will actually try to do it do it every day.
Yeah, build that muscle up. Andy, 2 last questions for you. These are always the same and intentionally vague, so you can take it in any direction that you'd like. But first question, what is one widely held belief that revenue leaders have today that you think is bullshit or no longer serving us?
I think I'm gonna give you two. So one think I've already mentioned, which is I think the biggest problem, or I guess I'll do as a belief, is there's a belief it's like you gotta be fast on making making decisions. And I'm like, okay, so that's true. But as I said, you really have to incorporate yes, no, not now. Like the thing that I see that I'm doing the most of is really working with teams to basically say like, you have got to put this in, because what you're doing is you're basically saying yes to too much because you're afraid of saying not now. So like, you aren't saying no enough, but you're really not saying not now enough. So I think there's this belief of like, we got to make decisions quickly. And it's like, I don't really want you to slow down, but I want you to kind of parse these into different groups. So that's one. So let me give the second one, which might apply to the more of the rules, because I might be breaking the rules in my first answer. So I think we're now in this mode or belief that we needed to shut down like all non-measurable activity, right? We basically like and the dirty word of branding. Basically, it's like, okay, like we have decided like let's shut all this down because we need to become profitable. Now, I agree. We need to become profitable. And I think we were too far on the other extreme. But I think we're going to be I'm a little concerned about the lack of really understanding that's like most people just aren't in market for whatever we're trying to do right now. And we actually need to build the brand. So, and we need to make sure that we're doing those things. I think what you and I talked about in social, I think that's good. I think we're doing some of that. And I don't know if we need to like rename branding, because I think that's a particular this one's a particular hot button. But I think it's a little bit it's a little bit of a problem that it's like, we decided it's like, well, it doesn't really serve us because it doesn't serve like profitability. And I'm like, well, it does. It just doesn't serve profitability like right now. Like it's like it is a long game, and some of what we have to invest in, it needs to be long game.
You bet. Well, especially with the advent of AI and just so many different kind of the consolidation of people in the space and each kind of vertical, that inevitably you have to play the long game while balancing the quick wins, kind of like your 3-step approach in a sense, like get the quick wins, but also be setting the stage for the long term. Okay, second question. What is one tactic or strategy that's working for you or the companies that you're serving?
Okay, so this one I already covered too. So I think the biggest thing that I'm running into is that companies are either paralyzed or they're like running around trying to do everything. So it feels like a little bit of both. And just by putting in something like a framework of a rule of 3 and saying like, let's just apply this as a rule across our teams and saying like, we're just going to do fewer things. And like everything is granular to like a meeting. We can't have 5 topics. Even to CEOs when I'm going through OKRs and saying like, they're going to be like, well, you got to do these 5 things next year. And I'm like, can't be 5. It's got to be 3. Like 5 means we're going to miss for sure. Like you got to get this, really narrow. So I think the narrowing of focus, is something that seems to be working and just getting teams to just, and feeling comfort about letting go around like, okay, I can let go of these other things. Like it'll be fine to just narrow the focus and actually work on these 3, but really trying to cascade that down. So I'll bring it back to, to make it even tactile. I mentioned the sprint system. So everybody is only allowed to have 3 things that they work on in the week, max of 3. I'm like, you only get 3. So what are your 3 that you want to work on for the week? And then when it comes to demo on Friday, you don't get the escape hatch. If I gave you 10, you'd come in on Friday and basically say, well, I hit so many, like I don't have anything to demo because I'm a partial on all these. And saying, nope, you only have 3 or a max of 3 because trust me, there are times where somebody's like, I got one thing I'm working on this week that I got to fix. I got to get this thing right or build. And then that's what they're demoing on to get it complete. So it's applying that rule of 3 all the way down, like to make it really granular.
I like that. Rule of 3. Always remember that. Well, Andy, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insight. Where can listeners find you?
Yeah, they're going to find me on LinkedIn for sure. So Andy Jolls. I'm not the only one, but probably for this group will be the main one that you'll actually find. And then you can also email me directly. So it's aj@ruxology.com.
Perfect. And for anyone that does not follow Andy, I highly recommend it because he actually shares some very tactical videos. And what we found with AI use cases is it's one thing to be told something. I think we all hear it a lot about what we can do with AI. It's another thing to actually see it demonstrated. And personally, I found it super helpful. So definitely highly recommend in terms of actual tactical videos on use cases and how to apply AI.
Very kind, Sophie.
Always a pleasure catching up, my friend, and hope to see you again in person soon.
I know it'll be soon. Thanks again.
Take care. And thank you to all the listeners. If you haven't checked out the GTM newsletter, I encourage you to do so. It'll be dropped in the show notes. You can find it on Scott or my profiles. Lots more go-to-market information there, but we will catch you next week.